Okay. I think that leaves us with no more ability to stall. And so I'm going to start things by stepping into Baroness Lola Young's shoes and just present to you just a little bit about our APPG. So we would normally be joined at an event like this by our chair, Alex Norris, and our co-chair, Baroness Young, and also Lord Moynihan, who is the vice chair of the APPG. But unfortunately, as I said earlier, Lola is having some difficulties with the transit today, and our other parliamentarians have been called into urgent meetings. So we're going to have to soldier on without them. The APPG on Sport, Modern Slavery and Human Rights brings together parliamentarians from all political parties with an interest in the issue of human rights in sports. Its mission is to find solutions to pressing human rights problems affecting the world of sport, with a focus on three specific areas: the human rights impacts of mega sporting events, the impacts of the UK Modern Slavery Act on professional sport companies, and human rights issues and discrimination in sport. As I mentioned earlier, the APPG Secretariat is hosted by the UN Global Compact Network UK. Our theme for today is athlete abuse and safeguarding, particularly in the UK context, and we will be looking to explore the roles and responsibilities of key actors. I'm going to moderate, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'll first hear from Elaine Francis, Head of Safeguarding and Athlete Support Manager at the British Athletes Commission. Then we have Professor Mike Hartle, Professor of the Sociology of Sport at Edge Hill University, and Director of the Center for Child Protection and Safeguarding in Sport. Then we'll have Heather Douglas, Head of Policy and Impact at UK Coaching, and then Michelle North, Service Head, Child Protection in Sport Unit, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Then we'll have Kimberly Walsh, Safeguarding Adults in Sport Manager at the Anne Craft Trust. And finally, we'll have a small delegation from the Everton Football Club, Catherine Wright, Head of Governance, Paul Cuthbert, Head of Safeguarding, and Chris Adamson, Head of Academy Education and Player Care. Okay, so that takes us to the end of Baroness Young's prepared remarks, and now you get my prepared remarks. And so as noted, I'm the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network. We act as a focal point for business in the UK that want to be sustainability leaders. We have over 800 business and non-business participants in our network. Among our many activities, in addition to hosting this secretariat, we organize well over 100 events a year across 3 work streams: climate action, business and human rights, and global goals. Okay. Over the last 5 years, there have been increasing reports, allegations, criminal convictions, and media coverage of abuse, bullying, harassment, and misconduct in the elite sporting world. Increasingly, we hear of cultures where athletes fear speaking up, serious complaints are dismissed, and inappropriate behavior is ignored. As a result, there is an ever-growing need to safeguard athletes, regardless of their age or their professional level. In December 2021, the National Plan for Sport and Recreation Committee published a report calling for a new, ambitious national plan for sport, health, and well-being, and a new approach within government to deliver and fund it. A link to that report is or soon will be in the chat for you. The committee stressed the need for a serious and robust approach to duty of care and safeguarding at both grassroots and elite sport levels. They recommended the implementation of the recommendations made in Baroness Grey-Thompson's independent review on duty of care in sport. And her recommendations included a sports ombudsman created by the UK government that has the power to hold national governing bodies to account for the duty of care they provide. an independent benchmark survey to measure duty of care, a board member at every national governing body responsible for duty of care, an exit survey for elite athletes as they leave performance programs, a duty of care charter setting out how participants, coaches, and support staff can expect to be treated and where they can go if they need advice, support, and guidance, a government-funded British Athletes Commission, and an extension of the duty to report to all sport organizations. The committee also called for greater monitoring and robust enforcement of duty of care and safeguarding standards by Sport England and UK Sport. This includes the imposition of financial sanctions against publicly funded bodies that fail to demonstrate that their safeguarding and duty of care policies are being effectively implemented. This is a great opportunity for policy change in this space. So in today's meeting, we want to raise awareness of athlete abuse and safeguarding, particularly in the UK context, and explore the roles and responsibilities of key actors in collaboratively addressing this pressing human rights problem through effective, preventive, remediation, and monitoring strategies. And now, before I hand the floor over to Elaine, I don't know if the camera is going to reach you, but I'm delighted to say, oh, there you can see her in the camera. So Lola's finished her morning run and has joined us here in the room. Do you want to, I've read your speech, so we're all caught up. Okay, thank you. So without any further ado, let's hand over the floor to Elaine Francis, Head of Safeguarding and Athlete Support Manager at the British Athletes Commission. Elaine, over to you.
Thank you very much. So the duty of care refers to obligations placed on people to act towards others in a certain way and in accordance with certain standards. There should be no doubt that in sport, we hold a universal duty of care towards athletes at any stage and throughout every stage of their career. Unfortunately, I have seen firsthand a vast disparity between the safeguarding standards to which sports settings are held accountable to in comparison to those of a school or local authority. For example, the professional registration of social workers and teachers required to practice, a public record accessible online of conduct concerns and actions taken, Ofsted visits, mandatory professional development and reporting. Our duty of care in sport supersedes that of child protection practice and spans greatly into the safeguarding of adults. Research repeatedly tells us that the further up the pathway an athlete is, there are increased vulnerabilities and a higher prevalence of abuse. In sport, we must all ask ourselves, what are the long-term effects of my actions on the athlete, both inside of sport and long after they have left? After moving from frontline child protection practice, my immediate observations of some sports settings was that of overwhelming insularity paired with a reluctance to report concerns outside of the organisation. The battle, however, is not one-sided, as I learned during my first experience of taking a sport referral to the Lado, when I was met with the response that the concern I was raising was just the culture in sport. For me, this demonstrates the critical need for not only safeguarding practices in sport to be elevated, but for knowledge and understanding of the complexities of sport to be educated to external agencies. On Thursday, the BAC welcomed the publication of the White Review, of which we are incredibly proud of our work towards. In July 2020, following the release of Athlete A, it became apparent that the issues of abuse in gymnastics was far from confined to that of the United States, as hundreds of British gymnasts and their family courageously stepped forward to share their experiences. As early as August, the BAC were inundated with disclosures, at which point we identified there was no single safe space for gymnasts to have their voices heard or receive support. While the BAC's primary responsibility is to provide independent and confidential support to world-class programme athletes, it is also crucial that we do everything within our power to ensure that the experiences that were being relayed to us should never be repeated in any sports environment. After seeking the financial support of UK Sport and Sport England, we initiated a bespoke response to those who had been impacted. This involved a partnership helpline with the NSPCC and the secondment of a team of individuals from specialist safeguarding backgrounds outside of sport who to date have provided support to over 280 individuals. Our rapid response to the concerns we were hearing and subsequent support package that we put into place is, in my opinion, world leading, as it involved the provision of online fact therapy sessions and one-to-one clinical assessment. We supported individuals to respond to the review's call for evidence, attend interviews, submit independent complaints, provided emotional support and safeguarding advice. The work of the BAC has evidenced how a collaboration of multi-organisations and diverse professional backgrounds can fill the glaring gap that existed within remedy for safeguarding practice in sport. Now this blueprint exists, it is crucial that sport continues this upward curve towards achieving the best practice. My key observations from this experience and urgent cultural points to remedy are the normalisations of practices within a culture that meant athletes were not always able to identify a concern and therefore abusive behaviours remained unchallenged, the lack of independence within the system and therefore in decision making, and that safeguarding was often seen as a tick box exercise. I cannot emphasise enough that safeguarding is not a luxury for an organisation but should be at the very core of every practice. A debate that has not, in my opinion, reached a conclusion in elite sport is what practices and how much can be tolerated in the name of pursuing success. It is my view that athlete welfare should be held with absolute paramountcy, as without athletes, sport is nothing more than equipment. To achieve this, there needs to be a shift in how this topic is viewed, and the word safeguarding can no longer be heard as a taboo. The best practice in sport is to move towards achieving prevention, and I believe we can do this by bringing standards in line with other sectors, with education and training that is regular, meaningful and interactive with an increased emphasis on athlete voice, accountability with the introduction of a centralised coaching database and the end of sports marking their own homework. I strongly reiterate the recommendation from the Duty of Care report and the White Review for the introduction of a sports ombudsman. And independence. The White Review highlighted athletes feeling unable to report concerns within their own governing body due to a culture of fear. Therefore, at its core, British athletes within the high performance system need an independent and safe space to go for advice, support and representation. Equipping an organisation like the BAC with increased capability to proactively support world-class programme athletes, together with a compulsory mandate for sports to engage with us, is critical in helping to safeguard athletes in the system. The BAC is also committed to growing its reputation as an established leader of the athlete voice and will continue to proactively represent athletes in order to influence relevant stakeholders in providing a better culture for British athletes to thrive and not just survive. Whilst the debate continues, I have seen firsthand the devastating and lifelong impact on hundreds of athletes who have been failed by the system. For me, there is no other reason needed for lessons to be learned and action to be taken immediately to see a genuine and irreversible shift within British sport. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elaine. Before moving on, just a reminder, there's lots of great material in the chat if you want more information on the British Athletes Commission or the White Review. You can click on those links. And don't forget, if you have questions for Elaine or any of the other speakers, to pop them into the Q&A box. Okay, onwards. Our next speaker, Mike Harthill, Professor Mike Harthill from Edge Hill University. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, thanks. I hope you can hear me all right. My internet connection seems a little unstable, so please shout if there's any problems. So if you can just click on to the next slide. Apologies for leaving some of the animation in here. If you can just do another 2 or 3 more clicks, that would be great. I just wanted to start by just briefly mentioning the historical context to this issue. This recognition and understanding of abuse in sport can be traced back to at least 1986, where Professor Celia Brackenridge brought the issue to sort of the heart of the coaching fraternity in the UK by delivering a paper. And there's a whole sort of history of a struggle by Celia and a few others to raise this issue, to bring it to the attention of the sports community. Another landmark was a BBC documentary in 1993 featuring Celia's research and victims of abuse in sport as well. Very little happened until the headlines about Paul Hickson, the Olympic swimming coach, being convicted to 17 years for rape and sexual assault of young swimmers in 1995. So I won't dwell on this anymore, but I just wanted to point out and just to set some context for sort of where we are at the moment. It clearly isn't a new issue, and there's a significant history around this issue in the UK particularly. Thanks, Cora. If you can click on. So I'm speaking from a research perspective. I'm an academic and researcher at Edgehill University. So I wanted to also highlight some important research that we've just completed with colleagues across Europe. So we wanted to investigate the prevalence, the scale of abuse in sport. We did this through the concept of interpersonal violence, which essentially maps directly onto our understanding of child abuse. So the 4 forms of sexual, physical, psychological, and neglect. So we're investigating those forms of abuse through an online survey designed by experts in the field and implemented by Ipsos Mori. So I'm just going to show you a very little bit of the data that we found. If you can click on, please, Cora. And just once again, please. So the categories that you can see from the bottom: psychological, physical, neglect, and then the top 2 are non-contact sexual violence and contact sexual violence. So this is just the UK data. I'll show you the combined data in a second. We had over 10,000 respondents in all. And what struck me with when the White Review was published was that the data from the White Review about negative experiences, of abusive experiences, almost exactly matches the data we have here in terms of psychological abuse and physical abuse. We weren't just looking at gymnastics. This was people that had participated in sport. But as you can see, psychological abuse, the most prevalent, down to contact sexual violence or sexual abuse within sport at 70%. So really disturbing numbers, but numbers that are actually not dissimilar to the handful of other prevalent studies that have been conducted. If you can click on, Cora, please. And this is the combined data. So as you can see, it's very similar. Okay, we've skipped over. That's fine. That's fine. The combined data of all countries was very similar to the UK data. This is again the UK data. We looked at gender and interestingly found that in all categories, males reported significantly higher prevalence than females. So I won't go into this now, but this is obviously an interesting finding. If you can click on again, Cora. I just thought I would show some of the data on perpetrators. As many other studies have found, most commonly perpetrated by males, but far from exclusively. So you'll see the sort of purple bar there shows female perpetrators as well as where it involved males and females. So if you can click on again, please, Cora. The full report is available on our website with all the data. Click on again, please, Cora. This is coming through to me very slowly. I don't know whether it is for everybody else, but apologies if there's a delay. I just wanted to highlight another important issue, which is represented by the safeguarding advisory panel established by Sport England, the inclusion of athletes' voices and survivor voices, those who have lived experience of abuse in sport, as something that for too long was absent from the landscape of sport. I'm pleased to say, on the back of a research project that we did several years ago, England stepped in to see how they could help, and have established a panel which is comprised of individuals with lived experience of abuse. It's absolutely essential, not that we listen to athletes that have had these experiences, but that we include them in the solutions, we include them in the development of strategy, as I think as Elaine was really saying. So it's very small scale, but it's an important step, and I would like to see significantly more of it. If you can click on again, please, Cora. And I also just wanted to highlight, perhaps in a more optimistic note, some of the work that we've done around working with young people and providing young people with resources to this issue. This is a project back in 2014, which was based on the Council of Europe's campaign that 1 in 5 children experience some form of sexual exploitation. And a group of young people in the UK developed a social media campaign around that statistic, a hand signal campaign, as you can see, and got a lot of support from the sports community. But it really sort of demonstrated to me and others, if you enable young people, provide them with some resources, they can make a big difference and do a lot more than stuffy old blokes like me. So if you can click on to the last slide, please, and if you could just click through these, I just wanted to leave with some points to consider based on what I've just been saying. First of all, research has played a key role in the recognition of abuse in sport, and strategic approaches to safeguarding in sport are absolutely essential, and they must be informed by robust, independent data. The cases project I showed you was a bit of a snapshot project. It was just at a point in time. But of course, we need longitudinal data to collect real information about what's going on and how things are changing to inform strategy. There's also, as I'm pleased to say has been mentioned in the White Report, a lack of evaluation into policy implementation and the efficacy of measures to know, so we know what's working well, what isn't working, who it's working for. And then I think I'll just leave you with the final point really that I've just been talking about: the inclusion of lived experience of athletes and inclusion of children and young people. I think is essential to the future of safeguarding sport, and we need much more effort and resources around that. So thank you for listening. I hope I've not gone too much over my time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm amazed at the restraint of our audience in not having lots of questions for you. I do, so let's hope we have time at the end to explore some of those. Without any further ado, let's move on to Heather Douglas, Head of Policy and Impact at UK Coaching. Heather, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to start by an introduction of UK Coaching. We're trying to support the 3 million coaches that are working across the UK in terms of learning and development, but also listening to their lived experiences as well. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is stemmed from what's already been mentioned, but the Duty of Care in Sport report that Baroness Grey-Thompson released in 2017. And this is the opening paragraph for that report, which I think is really pertinent for today. So the most important element in sport is the people involved, where they are taking part, volunteering, coaching, or in paid employment. Sport relies on putting people, their safety, well-being, and welfare at the centre of what sport does. So today, I will be touching on two kind of strands to this. So how can coaches better care for their participants based on some of the research and some of the reports and the high priority press that we've been seeing for many, many years now? But also, how can we care for the coaches that find themselves in situations that they probably didn't think they would ever find themselves in? So if people is the instrument that delivers excellent experiences in sport and physical activity, we need to probably think about both sides of the story. If we could move on to the next slide, that would be great. So post the release of the report in 2017, UK Coaching interrogated the report with a fine-tooth comb and understood what our response could be to some of the recommendations within that report. The report was kind of weighted towards elite athletes. It did give a nod to grassroots and community delivery. And if you think about the coaching workforce of 3 million strong people, the large majority of that is actually a volunteer workforce. So how can we make sure, I think from what Emma mentioned, first of all, is from a preventative point of view, how can we make sure that our coaches are the best equipped to deal with and care for participants, but also to look after themselves? So we recognise that coaches have a duty of care to their participants and athletes, regardless of where they are on the pathway. Some of the recommendations within the report amplified that this was bigger than a safeguarding issue, and also looked in terms of racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of kind of emotional abuse and targeting. So we addressed those main themes in the duty of care report from a coaching perspective. So what would be within in our kind of lane that we could help support coaches with this? And we understand, as we have done for many, many years, that coaches need support beyond the technical aspects of coaching. So it's not about just correcting somebody's backhand or how to hold somebody specifically on the beam. What is the generic kind of pedagogical and coach-athlete relationship information that coaches really need to be thriving with? So we began to put the people's experiences at the heart of everything we do, and that included the athletes and the coaches. We consulted widely with the sector, so over 100 organisations, more than 200 coaches, and some of these organisations will be on the call today. And we developed a duty to care toolkit for coaches. And we made the conscious decision to call it the duty to care, to give it a personal responsibility for those coaches. If we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. So as mentioned, we wanted to amplify that this was bigger than a safeguarding issue. And we felt that the further 4 themes within the report of inclusion, diversity, well-being, and mental health were as important as safeguarding. So how could we get the parity for these other themes to be in line with safeguarding? Because arguably, some of these things will impact one another. 6,000 coaches have actually been through this piece of learning so far, and the response is really, really positive from our early evaluations. We are currently reviewing this toolkit because during lockdown, coaches were coming to us to say that they were scared to return to coaching from a safe to practice point of view. So they clearly have the athlete and the participant welfare at the forefront of their mind, even during the past 2 years of the lockdown situation. Next slide, please. Thank you, Emma. However, during lockdown, a lot of coaches did come to us with some of their own concerns. They possibly had more time to reflect. They probably had more time to think about themselves. And some of them were telling us that they're just a commodity. We just fill a timetable, almost like they were an input on a spreadsheet. So X number of coaching hours produces this many of athletes having a great time. And it was kind of overlooked as just an input. We overpromise and overdeliver. We relied upon for years and then dropped. We don't know who to go to for help. We feel lonely and isolated and disconnected from the wider support. We're forgotten heroes. The policies are not appropriate, and sometimes there's no help from the NGB. And this was a particular area that came to light to UK coaching, is that when a case is brought against a coach, the concentration, quite rightly, is all put and wrapped around the athlete. And the coach is often felt in a period of limbo, whether the allegation came through to be true or not. In that period leading up to kind of a verdict, the coaches really just do not know where to go. So I wonder if you could have the next slide, please. So what we thought is we need to really further investigate the position of the coach. So we invested in some research with Liverpool John Moores University quite recently, And we asked two questions. Well, we asked a number of questions, but some of the indicative findings from one of the first questions is, what is care and what does it feel like to be cared for as a coach? And the research study hasn't completed yet, but these are some of the indicative findings. So what is care and how do coaches feel cared for? So general health and well-being, so the ability to be able to cope. Value and recognition, and this could be actually quite a small thing in terms of, it doesn't have to be an award ceremony. It could be just the acknowledgement that they're doing a great job. That people understand the coach is a person, they're not just a job description, and get to know them personally. To be able to listen to coaches, but also to be heard, and it's a genuine, authentic listening to their concerns. Life-work balance, and I think the lockdown situation enabled coaches to reflect on this. What are the burdens that are being put on their shoulders that can actually have an impact on their life-work balance? How can they have the bandwidth to think about everything that they've been asked to do beyond the technical application of that sport? And they often think that a support network of peers is really useful to have them as a care system. You can have the next slide, please. How do coaches feel when there is a lack of care? Well, there's sometimes the element of judgment, and this judgment is often from people who don't understand the coaching process, who often don't actually understand the investment that coaches make. So it could be from parents, it could be from other committee members. Control, so being micromanaged again by people that don't fully understand the coaching process. Finance isn't necessarily about a remuneration or being paid to coach. It's actually about the investment that coaches give, both in time, but obviously in money, to actually attain that education and training. And if we think of one of the things about being from a preventative point of view in safeguarding and the ability to deliver technically exceptional sessions, it costs a lot of money to get that education and training to enable them to be fit for purpose. Being authentic in the surroundings that you're at. And again, this can link back to some of the things about where you can feel cared for. And some of these are actually the binary opposite of some of the things on the previous slide. So isolation, not knowing where to go if they've got a problem. And general disrespect would actually kind of be a combination of all of these other 5 boxes. So that's kind of where the research is taking us. And what we want to do with this research is make sure that everywhere in the system, from participant through coach education manager, through coach system builder, through to policy, is understand the gateways in each of those pathways from getting athlete to policy, that we have some safeguarding in place, that when something happens and it is a kind of route through the system, that the blame is not always at the coach's door. I'm not here to say that everything that's happened isn't at the coach's door. We do know that there has been some very bad people out there, but often there's some very good people out there just doing bad things because they haven't been protected within the system. So if we can move to the next slide, please, just to sum up. We will be continuing this deeper dive research into the coach's experience and how the system can play a part on the field of play, but right throughout from policy decisions, and work with employers and deployers of coaches to enable them to better care for the coaches in their charge. At the end of the day, UK coaching is here for the coach, but to make sure that the coach can be here for the participant at the end of the day. And then just one final slide. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you've got some questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Heather. Yeah, I think some potentially controversial comments there. So I'm glad to see our first question has come in. Do please keep them coming. I noticed someone has their hand up, just to say we're not going to be opening the floor to the audience, but we're very keen for you to comment in the chat or to put your questions in the Q&A. We're slipping on time a bit, so I'm going to have to ask the rest of our speakers to do try to keep to your 5 minutes best you can. And let's hand over the floor to Michelle North from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me today. So as said, I'm Michelle North and I'm the service head of the Child Protection in Sport unit. So I think the unit is part of the NSPCC, and one of the things that we were asked to think about are around standards. And so Mike in his presentation talked about the cases that came up in the late 90s, and as a response to that, the CPSU was set up, and it was the safeguarding and protecting standards that were developed to really try and help sport understand the safeguarding legislation and guidance across the UK, because they were written mainly for social workers or teachers or those kind of sectors, and it didn't really relate to sport. So the standards were written as a way to help sport understand their responsibility, put it in language that they understand. Like Heather said, recognise the value of volunteers, and those were missing in legislation at that time. It was only in 2018 that sport was mentioned in working together. So the standards were there and set up for funded organisations. But one of the things that we need to consider when we talk about sport is that there is a whole breadth of sport and physical activity out there. So what happens to those sports and organisations that aren't getting funding through the sports councils? Where are they getting their support? What are the standards looking like for there? And this is a real risk area, and I think this is possibly where a sport ombudsman could really, really help the sector as a whole. So when I was asked to come and present today, I was thinking about how's the best way to do it. And as a team, we've been reflecting over the last few years of the different cases that have come up, the high profile cases that have come up in sport that we're all aware of. And I think what has ended up happening is that certain sports have had a case or a number of cases, and others think, well, that's not me, we're not football, etc. But actually the learning from them, like any serious case review, is relatable across the sector. So we had a look at what those investigations and independent reviews identified as the learning outcomes. And so these were football, athletics, cycling. There's a number of them, and I can share the paper that we did on this. But there were 6 key priorities, and a lot of these have been mentioned by Elaine, Mike and Heather, but the importance of prioritising safeguarding at a really high level, particularly at senior levels. It's really important that we create a culture where people can be open, that aren't fearful. We've kind of come to a point where people have policies and they have them in place, but it's how do we really enact them to make sure that safeguarding is bedded throughout a whole organisation. And that good governance, that will nurture improvements in safeguarding practice. It will permeate down. So that senior level is really, really key. There needs to be robust policies and procedures, as I mentioned, and these need to include things like codes of conduct and safer recruitment. But they need to be living documents. I need to know what I'm signing up for a code of conduct, and what's the risk if I break that? What is the sanctions? These need to be shared as well with all the stakeholders in sport. So most of the time, the staff or the lead safeguarding officer will know about those. But what about the young people, the participants and the parents? How well are we explaining that? You can put a 200 page document on a website, but the reality of a parent reading that and understanding it is not good. So we need to get better at bringing that to light. There needs to be a training plan around safeguarding. People need to know what a concern looks like. And this is particularly true in sport. And what we've seen in the White Report, as we're all still digesting that, is what are the risks for certain sports? And that needs to be trained. And that's for all stakeholders. So young people, parents, the board, to have an understanding of what a concern is, what to do with it, how to report it, and what can you do if you're not happy with the response. There needs to be better communication with parents and young people. This is a massive gap in sport. We have to really help them understand what is okay behaviour and what isn't. If we're not clear about that, then we can't expect them to be. Children won't come forward because they won't be sure that this isn't what's meant to happen. And parents, we've seen examples of this where they've just normalized certain behavior because they wasn't clear that it wasn't okay. So there needs to be almost a public support to kind of get that message out. There needs to be clearer reporting procedures. in all organisations. When there are complications with that, this is where complaints can fall through the gaps when it becomes slightly more overcomplicated, and something central within that organisation. So there's not different things happening at clubs or in regions, and that needs to be, again, really clear to everyone involved. But we keep hearing this word around culture. Organisations, whether you're funded or not, need to have clear safeguarding strategies that outline the direction of travel for safeguarding, so that it gives it the importance it needs, it builds in accountability. National governing bodies should really build on current affiliation requirements and start to introduce club development visits as a support to directly engage with clubs, young people, parents, anyone involved in the club, to really understand what's going on there. It's not good enough to say we didn't know. This way it would be clear how safeguarding is being embedded at all levels, and the voices of young people and adults are key to this. A coaching register would really help with being able to know what to look for in a coach. If you're a parent trying to find activity for your child, you want to know they're trained, they're insured, they've got criminal records checked, they've had their training. There's nowhere to do that. And at the moment, there isn't a possibility where coaches can fall through the gaps when they move from sport to sport. And this is an absolute gap that needs fill in, and this probably links to the DBS review as well. And I know they're looking at the checking for self-employed coaches, but this is a massive risk area for sport. We shouldn't be asking more of employed coaches than we are of self-employed, so we can't check them at the moment. But we also need to simplify the process to ensure that anyone who works with children are checked, and we're able to do that. And it's not about falling out of regulated activity. It's about having access to children, and the sector is unable to risk assess this when regulated activity makes that really difficult. And I think before I finish, I just wanted to build on what Heather said. We hear a lot around sport and the negativity around it, but I truly believe there is added value for sport if we can get this right. It can be the eyes and ears of society in protecting children rather than placing them at further risk. But we have to ensure that all those that are involved in sport are the right people. They've got the right skills, they have got the right training and support. And a bit like people have mentioned around research, but it's really, really key. So at the moment, CPSU is working with Loughborough University about cases that are reported, but this isn't mandatory. So we're only getting some sports to report their cases. So we need to make sure that we are getting a full picture of the cases that are coming up in sport. But over the last few years, the data has shown that actually the majority of the concerns that have come up are happening outside of sport, but are recognised through sport, through robust safeguarding procedures. And again, I'm not saying that bad things don't happen in sport, but it's really important we see that we can see it as a force for good. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's move right along now to Kimberly Walsh, Safeguarding Adults and Sport Manager at the Anne Craft Trust.
Hi, so I've got 4 key areas I'd like to try and talk about, and I know that we are running short of time, so I'll just get straight into them. So the first is really the need to ensure that every sport has minimum best practice standards for safeguarding in place, and this includes for adults as well as children. So there are some quality assurance processes that currently exist, and it's already in Michelle's just mentioned it there. So for sports that have got a national governing body, they do have their annual affiliation process. And so this is an opportunity for checks to be carried out with clubs, for example, at either the point of affiliation or throughout the year. But this current system is really very varied across individual sports, and it's not really currently as robust as it could be. So there's potential for improvement there. But I'm aware that there are quite a few challenges for NGBs in managing this, mainly around sort of capacity and really the scale of the task that's involved. But the White Review that was recently published did talk about that disconnect between NGBs and their clubs and what's happening on the ground. And we believe this isn't just unique to gymnastics. And in terms of ensuring NGBs themselves have got minimum standards in place, we do currently have the Act's Safeguarding Adults in Sport framework, and that is written into funding agreements. So Sport England have introduced that as a requirement this year. And there's also the Code of Governance, which is again for funded organisations to be following. And it does have a new requirement for safety and wellbeing leads on the board. The potential gaps with both of these requirements is that they don't always need to have everything in place before necessarily receiving their funding, that they work towards having things in place during the funding period. And also with the Safeguarding Adults in Sport framework, for example, we don't yet know how much the funders are sort of going to enforce that and what consequences, if any, there'll be for those that aren't completing it. And the biggest area, which again Michelle's touched on, is all those sports and activity organisations and independent providers out there who don't have any affiliation body or are not in receipt of funding. So there's currently no one holding them to account at all, no current requirements asked of them. So at ACT, we are aware of this gap as well. So we are currently finalising a sort of self-assessment process using themes and criteria from our framework that's specifically aimed at them. But obviously that does rely on them being self-motivated to complete that and act on the outcomes themselves. So one of the ways to remedy this and ensure that consistent requirements and quality assurance is across all sports, not just those that are funded, is the establishment of that independent sport ombudsman that we've all talked about. So this really is my key second point. You've already mentioned, obviously, it's an outstanding recommendation from the duty of care report. So we are in complete support of it as well. And that idea that it really needs to be the whole sport and activity sector to really be effective. You know, sport is the odd one out really in not having that sort of independent regulatory body when we provide services and engagement with so many large numbers of people as sport does. So it really would have a significant impact in helping solve lots of the challenges and gaps that are identified in the sport sector. And I know we've talked lots about having it in place, but actually I just got a few points about, you know, why are we saying this? And it's because it would help give that opportunity of oversight across the whole sector, which we just don't have the ability to do that at the moment. Obviously, it's going to help enforce minimum requirements and also that independent reporting route, which is really important and which has been highlighted in several of the reviews and by Athlete Voices as well. And it's also a process for which potentially you can check the ratings of an organisation or activity for you to get involved with. So, you know, you can currently look up data about schools, care homes in your area, and, you know, make those informed decisions about if you want to use them. You know, there's no such way of doing that for sport organisations at the moment. And it's also going to provide a means for collecting data. So I know there's research projects that are going on, but we do currently lack data specifically about safeguarding adults within sport. So an ombudsman is going to help provide opportunities to maybe track trends, which we could use to inform best practice, give us that greater understanding of prevalence of safeguarding adults and children's concerns across the sector. It's also going to give that mechanism for reviewing practices and also identifying lessons learned, which again, you know, other speakers today have talked about that real need to just recognise and act on lessons that have been learned. So my third point, again, others have mentioned, but it's really that importance of culture. So the Ancraft Trust started an awareness campaign last year called Safer Culture, Safer Sport. And we did this because it was becoming so increasingly a theme in relation to safeguarding adults in sport. And the types of queries we were answering, you know, we believe if you get the right culture, that is the foundations for a safer sport. You know, we find many of the concerns that are coming in within sport in relation to adults are not about adults at risk as defined in the Care Act. So local authority safeguarding adults teams wouldn't be dealing with them. And it's back to clubs and national governing bodies that are managing those concerns and supporting the individuals internally. And a lot of those concerns are in relation to unsafe cultures and poor practice. So really the organisations need to have that culture where welfare, safety and well-being is really at the heart of their values and actions. And that's not only going to help reduce the risks for those involved, but also to keep people in their sport. Because all too often, if someone isn't happy in their sport, they're going to just leave it. And obviously we don't want that to be the case. So I think when we're considering our safeguarding and duty of care requirements and how we might measure that for organisations, culture must really be given that strong emphasis in addition to all those compliance-based aspects like policies and procedures. And they are less tangible, and it's not always as black or white, but we need to be looking at things like, how are the senior leaders and board members leading and modelling that positive culture and behaviours in their organisation? You know, are they genuinely prioritising safeguarding and duty of care? Or, as I know other speakers saying, is it a tick box exercise? And also that idea, is there mechanisms in place to hear the voices of those involved in sport and to genuinely hear it and to act on it? And also, are the boards committed to that organisational learning? Do they actually accept feedback? Do they acknowledge their shortcomings? And do they genuinely want to change where it's required? So that's safer culture really has to be there, so people feel listened to and valued, and it's person-centred. So we really has to stop, safeguarding has to stop being that add-on and really be seen as that integral and embedded in the culture and lived values. And it's about how we can support organisations to achieve that, and also to sort of measure it, which is sometimes that harder element. And then just moving on to my final point, which is about the need to increase the prioritisation, awareness and education for safeguarding adults. So safeguarding adults is newer to sport than safeguarding children. And although we've made a significant progress, we still have got some way to go with awareness raising and understanding within the sector. So we know that training and education is essential, and that organisations need to prioritise the time and resources so that their workforce and their participants have the required knowledge and skills to keep themselves and others safe. And this needs to include adults. Just a good example which highlights the different levels of priority given to areas of education is with anti-doping. You know, when a high performance sport is asked to complete anything in relation to anti-doping, it's usually immediately actioned. And I think I'm right in saying that anti-doping training, for example, is a requirement to be completed before athletes can compete internationally. Well, there just isn't that impetus with safeguarding training. Safeguarding adults training isn't currently mandatory for coaches' qualifications or for staff or volunteers within organisations at any level. You know, often coaches are required to complete safeguarding training and for that to be renewed, but safeguarding adults training isn't a requirement. And we know that lots of adults take part in sport and activity across the UK, you know, and there's increasing focus on reaching underrepresented groups and engaging the adult population in more activity. We've got social prescriptions and the benefits that activity has on mental health. So that really is a significant gap which needs to be addressed. And then just a final point is about if we're talking high performance and elite sport and athletes and the education to them. I know in the duty of care review that was talking about athlete inductions, and I believe many sports have been providing more information to athletes joining their talent pathways and the high performance programs, which is great. However, some of the information given tends to be focused on what's expected when they're on the program, what equipment they might need, how much the program might cost, and how many hours training is expected. But really, if we're actually focused on that safeguarding and duty of care and educating them about how to be safe, they need to hear about what are their rights and what do they do if they feel those rights aren't being met. You know, what does the organisation have in place to support them? They should be told that, who to contact if they have concern. They should be told about all the various methods available to them to feedback, and that feedback is really encouraged and welcomed. And also they need to be told what behaviours are expected from those who work with them, not just behaviours that are expected of them as individuals. And just to finish on that, so Ancraft Trust and the Child Protection Sport Unit have been starting to deliver training jointly to the high performance athletes and their staff. And so that's been well received and something that we're going to be continuing. And their training does include information like the points I've just raised. So hopefully just one final point is just that, you know, safeguarding adults is continuing to be more aligned. Can we ask that that continues to be considered to be aligned more with safeguarding children's requirements, and just safeguarding adults included in these conversations about duty of care, and hopefully some of these points have helped with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. Okay, before handing over to Everton Football Club, it does look like we'll have a little bit of time for questions. We have two teed up, but do please add them into the Q&A box if you've got any questions. And now delighted to hand over to Catherine Paul, and Chris from Everton Football Club. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We just wanted to tell you a little bit about how we do safeguarding within the Everton Academy Boys setup. Could we move to the next slide, please? So the way that we see safeguarding risks, our biggest risks to our athletes, the first one is the imbalance of power between players and coaches, and the position of trust that coaches are in, and the fear of being dropped. Closely linked to that is the financial impact around athletes. So as you all know, the financial reward of becoming a first team Premier League football player is significant, and therefore again linking to that worry of being dropped, of not making it. Again, closely linked to that is our agents and intermediaries. So unfortunately, not everybody in those roles and positions have the best interests of the athlete at heart, or the player, should I say. They stand to make a percentage or a profit from any kind of signing, and therefore, again, linking back to financial and imbalance of power. And the fourth on our list is the increased risk now to athletes of social media. So our players are more widely available than they ever have been, to be contacted by adults, agents, or anybody that should deem that they should need to contact a player for any purpose. Our academy coaches boys from the pre-academy age of around 5 through to our under 21s age group, so quite wide ranging in terms of the risks and age groups that we deal with. We are, I would say, quite lucky with the Premier League. So the Premier League the FA are our regulatory body, but the Premier League equally are our regulatory body as we are in the Premier League. Other clubs lower down the football pyramid aren't quite as lucky as we are. The Premier League have developed a set of youth development rules, and within there is Section X, purely dedicated to safeguarding. There are also rules within that framework for player care education as well, which Chris will talk about shortly. Furthermore, there is 7 Premier League safeguarding standards, and that's to really raise the bar of how we do safeguarding at the club, really embedding from the strategy and board level commitment through to culture, protection, training, and reporting. We are also required, or we participate with the aspects of working together to safeguard children, keeping safe in education, and the Sexual Offences Act of 2003 was also expanded to include coaches and close the loophole. For all these regulatory aspects, we are audited. So the Premier League Bernardo's team come and audit our safeguarding standards every season, and the PJAC auditors, a professional game academy audit company, come and audit the academy around all aspects of their rules on an annual basis. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Okay, thanks, Catherine. At Everton, our commitment to safeguarding is based on the idea that safeguarding is the responsibility of everybody in the organisation, and that along with a multidisciplinary team approach to the protection of children and young people. So it's not just coaches and it's not just player care staff or the safeguarding team, but it's actually everybody's responsibility within the organisation. So from an academy perspective, as Catherine's talked about, the young age groups, 5 to under 21s, and the structure of the academy is such that there's a lead coach and an assistant coach with each age group, but multidisciplinary team staff around those ages and those phases of ages. But the reality is that the coaching staff will always be the first point of contact with the boys and the players and their parents. So it's a big responsibility. So it's important that coaches are well supported. Education and player care staff then sits across all age groups and actually travel with the boys on that journey, the academy journey, and really a constant source of off-field support throughout that journey. Education and player care staff work closely with coaches, and there's regular communication with parents, players, the schools that the boys go to, and ultimately they develop a comprehensive knowledge of the boys and their families. So it's very much a pastoral role, and one that encourages the boys to talk. So it's vital really for effective safeguarding. education and player care staff do, I suppose, develop relationships with boys that are different to, but that complement the relationship that the coach has with the player. And of course, there's close working relationships between all academy staff and the club safeguarding team.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Morning, everyone. I will be quite sparing, conscious that there are three of us. So, just to touch on a couple of points before we move on to the next slide. At Everton, the club has invested quite heavily in the safeguarding response. We have myself as head of safeguarding, have dedicated member of staff in the academy, and I think that's really important as a single point of contact, a consultant, if you will, for staff to seek advice should they have a concern. We do encourage the culture of safeguarding as everyone's responsibility. And whilst we work for the club, the safeguarding team, we are 100% obligated to the children and young people. I think that's really important. So we do receive a concern. We have got the ability to go right to the top of the club and raise that. We've also set up a strong network in terms of a safeguarding response. So we have devised on site at our Finch Farm training site a team of safeguard champions. So if you do believe that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, as we do, you may ask, well, what does that look like practically? And for me, it's about building relationships, and that really feeds into that culture. So we have devised a series of champions who will work in a variety of roles across the academy, from kitchen staff to car park stewards to managers, and everyone sees safeguarding from a slightly different perspective, but the message is always the same. And I think that brings a rich safeguarding response. We've got people with those eyes and ears spread right across the football academy. Chris, I'll just pass it over to you there. You're going to go over a couple of points on this slide.
Yeah, so at Everton, how do we safeguard young athletes? Well, with a proactive approach, we'd start with strong, trusting relationships and good communication with all stakeholders to ensure really that if there are any concerns amongst any of the playing public, we're aware of them, we can share that information with relevant people and that we can address them. So I mentioned a multidisciplinary team approach. So there's regular meetings that take place across all the disciplines: coaching, medical, sports science, education and player care, to share that information. We do player wellbeing screening, particularly at the older ages. We have a dedicated player support group with key staff, including the clinical psychologist, which meets regularly to identify and address any concerns amongst the playing population. Premier League requirement for a dedicated player care role for all Category 1 academies, and from next season for Category 2 and 3 academies, and there's funding from the Premier League and the English Football League to support this. So that gives an idea of the Premier League and the EFL's commitment to player welfare. So player care staff are there for the players and can often act as a conduit between player and coach, and it's a really important role given the kind of information we've spoken about. Regular Premier League reviews for our under-18 scholars, which is standard across the Premier League and Category 1 academy clubs. It gives boys the opportunity to speak to somebody independent of the club. Information in education and training for parents and accommodation providers is crucial. This is done through sessions, maybe information communicated via newsletters, gathering feedback from parents and other stakeholders, and the promotion of campaigns such as the NSPCC Parents and Sport Week. We deliver a life skills personal development education programme for the boys in conjunction with organisations such as the PFA and Sporting Chance, and again are able to signpost boys to certain areas and certain organisations. And the reviews really are an important aspect. The individual reviews with the boys are an important aspect of the work we do to try to get them to talk and open up.
Okay, thanks. And just a couple of points from myself. So it's been mentioned a couple of times this morning about safeguarding culture and effective safeguarding culture. And it's mentioned before about how bad practice can be normalised. And I think in terms of our ambition, we need to make it the case that good practice is normalised. In 5 years, we're talking about good practice being normalised and being commonplace. So for me, the key way to do that is through being visible and consistent, and that consistency is hugely important for me as a practitioner in safeguarding. Consistency and constant drip of safeguarding message right across the organisation is hugely important. It leans into another box you can see there to the right, safeguarding training. Again, it's been picked up on this morning already, but at Everton we have a forward-looking training calendar and a TNA. So we look at what roles we have right across the football spectrum, who needs what training and when. So it's forward planned. So there's no drift in our ambition to deliver consistent training. I think that's really important. So the safeguarding culture and awareness, safeguarding training for me are linked quite rightly so. We've also invested in a safeguarding referral system, reporting system, which makes it really easy for our staff to report concerns on the go. So with the bespoke software the club have invested in, so coaches don't have to wait until they get back to the computer to raise a concern. They can do it from the mobile device, and the referral system is really easy. So we want to simplify that, which is something we have done. And just to finish off from me, we do believe in that high-level buy-in for safeguarding. So we have a governance structure which requires us, quite rightly, to brief the senior leadership team and a senior safeguarding lead at the club. We have that very direct and good relationship with our chief executive officer. So we've got that buy-in from the very top. If you get that right, hopefully it can filter down, as was remarked upon before. So, but obviously we still need to develop and improve, as I think we all do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Really nice to finish with an example of really good practice. So thanks very much, Everton Football Club. So I think we do have some time to deal with some of these questions that have rushed in towards the end. We're going to take a couple of those and then going to hand over to Baroness Young. And we'll start with, so a reminder that you can vote for the questions if there's one there that you're really keen that we get to. But for the moment, the top question, and it's one that I had written down to ask myself, from Liz Twyford. The need for a coaching register seems to keep coming up. What is needed to make this happen? Is this something for government to legislate on? Now, if I may, Michelle did raise this earlier, but I'm thinking, Heather, we probably should hear from you on this to start. What's your view on a coaching register, and do you see any problems with that, and any barriers that we might need to overcome to bring that into being?
I think the first point to make is that a coaching register, a registration scheme, shouldn't be seen as the silver bullet to solve all of these problems. I think there needs to be kind of a look at the harm prevention continuum across the system, and look at a truly kind of thought out workforce governance approach to this. And I know that ourselves, the Chartered Institute, Simspa and Sport England are looking into the scoping of this work. Some feasibility studies have been completed, and we just need to take that forward. It really needs to be kind of athlete up, what is needed there, but also DCMS down. And I think it might even be multi-departments that may need to come on board with that, including the Ministry of Justice and other people involved in that. A coaching register is a great idea. It doesn't come in terms of not having its problems. It needs to be seen as a frictionless thing if we're wanting to professionalise the small p, including the volunteers, the coaches, to enable them to display themselves of having great skills and great credentials. But for another hoop for a volunteer to coach to jump through, we need to make sure that it's a benefit to a coach to be part of this register as well, not just from a regulatory point of view.
Thanks, Heather. Michelle, did you want to comment on this one as well?
Yeah, I think Heather's absolutely right. It's like a lot of these things. Sport's not a homogenous group, so that register will be quite tricky. It does need to be led by government, I believe, and I think there needs to be proper investment to understand coaching. Some sports don't call them coaches, some of them aren't qualified. We wouldn't want to create a two-tier system where, because of the way the sports are made up, it it kind of demonstrates that they might not be safe, because that's not the same either. So a true understanding of what coaching is and how that works, but it is part of a whole plan. You know, we've talked about training, we've talked about culture, senior leadership buy-in, research, reporting, measuring. All those things are part of that safer environment for sport, but I do believe that this would really help the sector.
Thank you both. Did anyone else want to make a very quick comment on this, or shall we? Okay, let's move on. The next question that came in early, it's quite broad, so and it's been posed to all panelists. So I'm tempted to, in fact, I'm going to invite the panelists to feel free to answer this in writing if you feel compelled to do so. But the question from Simon is, how can we integrate and enhance the role of lifelong learning in addressing athlete as learners, safeguarding and well-being? What are the resources? Where are they? How accessible are they? Many thanks. So I see Michelle has started typing. Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to comment on that aspect? Okay, then we'll look forward to seeing Michelle's written answer. Oh, is there? Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, it's Chris here. Yeah, probably from our point of view, an answer to that one would be the life skills curriculum that we plan and deliver to all of our age groups. It really comes into prominence with our under 18s and under 21s, the older boys, and try to instill those kind of values and ideas in the boys from those ages.
Great. Okay. Thanks also to Everton for answering the question from Zara, aka Lucy, regarding catering and other stuff. While today we want to focus on athlete abuse, of course, the APPG is interested in the wider sport community, so we really appreciate that question and that you've taken care of answering it. Okay, Rory, I'm going to pause your question and I'm going to hand over to Baroness Young just to make sure that we have time to get through your question. So.
Oh, right, okay. Well, first of all, apologies for arriving late for reasons which I'm sure we all appreciate, those of you who live in London, especially perhaps. But I did hear all the presentations, which is great, because the variety of approaches and importantly, the examples of good practice are, you know, there to keep us going, because otherwise it can feel terribly sort of depressing and demotivating. However, we have to admit that there is a huge problem, not just in sport, but in broader society. And I think that some of the points that I wish to raise, or some of the questions I wish to ask, kind of connect with some of those wider points, which, as Steve has pointed out, is within the remit of this particular group. As you can tell from the title, we have quite a broad sort of idea about modern slavery, human rights, and so on as they affect sport. I think one of the features for me is that it's only relatively recently that the public, the general public, even the sports consuming public, has begun to articulate or think about these issues. And it's been partly because it's not been sort of hugely in the public domain, but now with the succession of reports on this area in particular, it's hard to avoid. But one question I have, and again, you know, we may not have time to address all of these questions, but one question that I have is, you know, what more do we need to do with the general public in order to make sure that the pressure to make the changes that we need to happen are felt by government, by governing bodies, etc., etc. And obviously there's an overlap because you might be a member of the general public, but also a parent of a child that's going to training or whatever. But just generally speaking, we need that kind of pressure, I think, much more in sports perhaps. And some of you may have some ideas about that. I was struck by, I think it was Heather who mentioned the 5 pillars regarding different kinds of different areas where abuse might take place, as it were. And again, this connects to this kind of wider societal issues that we're still trying to deal with, which would include racism, homophobia, mental health issues, etc., etc. So I'm kind of interested in, from a research angle, the extent to which some of those areas are or have an implicit or maybe even explicit connection to the area of abuse, particularly sexual abuse and violence. So in other words, to what extent are the survivors of those abuses also been subject to homophobia or to racism? And I know that's been the case in some of the awful examples that have been thrown up by the by football in football. So I'm just kind of interested and sort of think that there may be some research, because there may be patterns of behaviour from coaches or from organisations that fail to spot, that's not quite the right way of putting it, but I just think there might be patterns of behaviour and organisational features which can be sort of characterised as being more open to and so I think perhaps, I don't know, maybe Mike might want to say something a little bit about that if there's time. The question that I wanted to ask around what more could government do has already really been posed in terms of, you know, do we need more regulation and legislation? But just as somebody said that the I think it was Heather who said that, you know, registering coaches isn't a silver bullet, neither is legislation, because unless it's really well monitored and implemented, then it can be just like a fig leaf for you know, making it appear that something's been done, but when very little has been achieved. So I think, you know, one must have in mind anytime we talk about regulation, legislation, about how it's actually going to be implemented and monitored. And I think the adults at risk is an important issue that was raised by, I think it was Kimberly, and hello Kimberly, I think we've had conversations about these areas in relation to modern slavery, the risk of modern slavery in sports, particularly around young people from the global south. And so I was quite sort of struck by this thing about adults as well. But it led me to think, along with some other comments that were made, whether the area of boards and governance is something that we should look at in terms of the diversity of voices that you get on those structures, and the extent to which, if they're kind of monocultural, are we going to keep reproducing these situations because you haven't got enough people to say, well, hold on a minute, have you thought about, or my experience has been, or this is what we should be looking for. So I think, again, it goes broader than this admittedly huge area. And then just finally, because football is my thing, as everybody who knows me knows, but I'm interested in, with the increasing focus on girls and women in football, are we going to see more learnings, not only from the situations in boys and male football, but also across other sports? So it's a question, I guess, for Everton colleagues, which is, you know, about the extent to which it's possible to, and already in practice, perhaps, a learning from other sports and the experience around girls and women in particular in some of those quite difficult situations that can arise. So that's it. A whole suite of questions.
So here's what I'm thinking. We've got about 5 minutes because we need to allow 1 minute to wrap up. Let's go to Mike first. And I'd like to just add to Lola's question, because I was struck by your presentation. One, the surprising result, at least for someone like me, that more complaints coming from males than females. And so is that just, if you can give us 30 seconds on that, is that just an artifact somehow of the data collection processes or what your thinking is on that. Maybe on trend in terms of, is it getting worse, is it getting better? And then to Lola's points, more about sort of intersectionality, maybe for want of a better way to sum up. Mike.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so what we've sort of found, but I'm going to deal with the other point first, if I can, on minority groups and discrimination, because we found, and other studies have found this, that prevalence is higher. These experiences are more frequent amongst groups, amongst ethnic minority groups, amongst those with disabilities, amongst gender minority groups, those who identify as gay, lesbian, transgender, all experience these things at a higher rate. So I think that's important to say. I think it's also important to add something in relation to the general conversation. Much of these experiences come from are between peers. So it shouldn't be assumed that it's between an adult and a child, or a coach and an athlete. It's often the peer group that of course the peer group is much larger. There are many more peer athletes than there are coaches, but it's important to point that out. In terms of the gender issue, there's been some other evidence in other studies which sort of resembles our findings, but it was quite striking to see that boys reported more experiences. There's different interpretations of this. We're still thinking about the data, but for me, I think one of the main things I see here is that is the culture of male sport. The White Review pointed out that females are more often coached by other females. We know that, and our data again shows that abuse is most often perpetrated by males. So I think we're sort of seeing the hyper-masculine culture of much of male sport, so I think that is one sort of important interpretation of why we're seeing higher prevalence rates amongst boys.
Thanks very much, Mike, and very succinct, appreciated. Let's go to Everton, maybe for just a minute to respond to Lola's comment. If I know that's a challenge, but if you would.
No problem. In terms of safeguarding with the women's football, it is gaining more and more traction. We treat our club operates as what we call the Everton family. We have a one club approach. So everything that we do in terms of safeguarding for the boys, we roll out across the girls as well. We do obviously appreciate the risks to girls are different to boys. For instance, with social media, our girls players are actively encouraged to post on social media about the football to raise the profile of girls football. So that presents another challenge. We are aware and appreciative of the fact that the FA are looking to review the rules this summer, and one of the proposed rule amendments is to require a full-time safeguarding officer for the women's team, and that's something that will really support us in pushing out our safeguarding strategy further into those areas. Hopefully that will help answer that one.
That's great, thank you. And now we're in our final minute. Did anyone, maybe Elaine or Kimberly, since you haven't had a chance to contribute during the Q&A on Lola's point about boards and diversity or not enough? Yeah, Kimberly, is that a hand? Yeah.
I noted down a comment that Lola made about adults at risk and adults, so I wondered if I could comment on that.
30 seconds on that would be.
Yeah, so it was just the idea that yes, like there's legislation for adults at risk, but we very much refer to talking about keeping adults and adults at risk, because everybody's got that right to be safe. And within sport, there's so many people that wouldn't necessarily fit the definition of an adult at risk, that it's so important that we talk about safeguarding adults, because of trying to capture that whole everybody's right to be safe from harm. And then it's just the idea that if it's an adult at risk, there's a different procedure that would happen in terms of managing and dealing with that aspect. I don't know if that helps.
Perfect. Elaine?
Yeah, and I guess my final point in terms of diversity at board level, it's to have that full diversity, isn't it, from athlete backgrounds, ethnic minority backgrounds, but also so importantly from athletes with lived experiences, to bring that right to the top with our leadership to drive that culture from the top down and learn from their experiences.
That's possible.
Yeah, and then a screen, so disregard it.
Okay.
For the comments.
But it is marking the end of our time. So Elaine, Mike, Heather, Michelle, Kimberly, Catherine, Paul, and Chris, thank you very, very much for giving of your time and your knowledge today. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all of our audience for joining us. That's also very much appreciated, and the team for pulling things together today in challenging circumstances. Do stay in touch. I think in the chat, maybe there's going to be coming a link if you're not on the mailing list already for the APPG. Do please sign up and stay in touch. We will have more events coming in the months ahead. And with that, I will wish you safe and speedy travels today, if that's possible. And I hope you all have a really good afternoon. And again, thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It's all nice to see you.
Bye.